Welcome to Final Curiosity. Today's tale is of an enslaved mother whose children were sold to pay a $100,000 debt. What she did next was the impossible. This is a painful, intense story of loss, desperation, and a choice no one thought she could make. Pause, take a breath, and listen closely. Before we start, subscribe to the channel and comment which city and country you're listening from. Your participation ensures these stories are remembered, not buried. Let's begin. In October 1855, in Adams County, Mississippi, a white plantation owner named Thomas Whitmore made a decision that would ultimately destroy everything he had built. He sold 3 children to cover a gambling debt of $1,000. But these were no ordinary children. They were his own flesh and blood. Children he had fathered through the systematic rape of an enslaved woman named Celeste. He sold his own sons and daughter like cattle, never imagining the woman he had brutalized for over a decade would become the architect of his complete and utter ruin. This is the story of what happens when a man underestimates the woman he believes he owns. It is a story of patience, of cunning, and of a mother's love so powerful it burned through every obstacle placed before it. It is also a story of justice, though not the kind delivered by courts or laws. This is the story of Celeste, and how she brought a powerful white man to his knees without ever raising a weapon. To understand Adams County, you must first understand Mississippi in the 1850s. Cotton was king in the American South, and Mississippi sat at the very heart of that kingdom. The state held some of the richest soil in the entire region, especially along the Mississippi River, where the land was dark and fertile from centuries of flooding. Plantation owners carved out massive estates from this land, some spanning thousands of acres. All of it was worked by enslaved people who had no rights, no freedom, and no legal protection from any cruelty their masters chose to inflict. Adams County was one of the oldest and wealthiest counties in the state. The county seat, Natchez, was home to more millionaires per capita than almost anywhere else in the United States. These were men who built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved laborers, living in grand columned mansions, while those who made their wealth possible lived in rough wooden cabins with dirt floors. The social hierarchy was rigid and absolute. White planters sat at the top, followed by white overseers and merchants, then poor whites who owned no slaves. At the very bottom, treated as property rather than people, were the enslaved. Thomas Whitmore was not one of Adams County's great planters, but he desperately wanted to be. His family arrived in Mississippi in the 1820s, purchasing a modest 400-acre property they called Whitmore Hall. It was not a grand estate by local standards, but it was respectable. Thomas inherited it in 1841, when his father died of yellow fever, and from the beginning he was consumed by the desire to expand, to grow, to join the wealthy elite whose approval he craved. But Thomas Whitmore had expensive tastes and little business sense. He gambled heavily on horse races and cards. He invested in ventures that collapsed. He bought things he could not afford to impress people who looked down on him anyway. By the early 1850s, Whitmore Hall was mortgaged to the limit, and Thomas was drowning in debt, a fact he hid from everyone, including his wife, Margaret. Margaret Whitmore came from a family with more social standing than money, which made her the perfect match for Thomas in one sense and a disaster in another. She brought respectability but no fortune. She was a cold woman, rigid in her beliefs and obsessed with appearances. The couple had 2 sons together, both sent away to boarding school in Virginia at young ages. Margaret ran the household with an iron fist, spending most of her time in social activities with other plantation wives, pretending all was perfectly fine at Whitmore Hall. At the time our story begins, Whitmore Hall was home to approximately 47 enslaved people. They worked the cotton fields, tended livestock, maintained the house, and performed every task necessary to keep the plantation running. Among them was a woman named Celeste. Celeste was born on a Virginia plantation around 1822. She never knew her father. Her mother, Ruth, a house slave, raised Celeste to be quiet, obedient, and invisible. Survival skills in a world where attracting attention could get you beaten or sold. When Celeste was 12, her mother was sold to a trader heading south to pay her master's debts. Celeste never saw her again. Sold separately to a family moving to Mississippi and changing hands twice more, she ended up at Whitmore Hall in 1837 at about 15 years old. Thomas Whitmore noticed her immediately. Celeste was what slave traders of the era called a fancy girl, a term that should make your skin crawl, but one used openly in the antebellum South. It referred to enslaved women and girls, considered attractive by white standards, often purchased specifically for sexual exploitation. Celeste had light brown skin, indicating mixed ancestry, and features Thomas Whitmore found appealing. Within months of her arrival, he began visiting her cabin at night. There was no courtship, no seduction, only power and violence. Thomas Whitmore raped Celeste for the first time when she was 15 and continued to assault her regularly for the next 18 years. This was not unusual in the antebellum South. Historians estimate that by the Civil War, the majority of enslaved people in America had some European ancestry, a statistic speaking to the epidemic of sexual violence white men perpetrated against black women for generations. Masters had total legal control over enslaved women's bodies. No law recognized the rape of an enslaved woman as a crime. In the eyes of the law, Celeste was property, and Thomas Whitmore could do whatever he wanted with his property. Celeste's first child, a boy she named Samuel, was born in 1843. The baby's skin was noticeably lighter than Celeste's, and his features bore an unmistakable resemblance to Thomas Whitmore. Everyone on the plantation knew whose child Samuel was. The other enslaved people, the white overseers, Margaret Whitmore, who never spoke of it directly. This was another ugly reality of plantation life that everyone understood, but no one discussed openly. Mixed-race children fathered by white masters were everywhere, living proof of systematic sexual exploitation that polite society pretended did not exist. 3 years later, in 1846, Celeste gave birth to a daughter she named Eliza. In 1850, she had another son, Isaiah. All three were Thomas Whitmore's children. All three were born into slavery, raised by Celeste alone in a small cabin behind the main house, while their father lived in comfort, just a few hundred yards away, and pretended they did not exist. Celeste did everything she could to protect her children and give them what small joys were possible within their brutal existence. She sang to them each night. She told them stories of a world where people could go wherever they wanted and do whatever they chose. She taught them to be careful, to stay out of sight, to never give any white person a reason to notice them. She also watched constantly for any sign Thomas might turn his attention to Eliza the way he had to her. A fear that haunted many enslaved mothers, knowing their daughters could be victimized just as they had been, with no power to stop it. By 1855, Samuel was 12, already working in the fields, tall for his age and strong, a good worker who kept his head down. Eliza was 9, a quiet girl who helped with domestic work in the main house and had learned, like her mother, to be invisible. Isaiah was 5, still young enough to play with the other children, still innocent enough to smile and laugh, despite the world he was born into. Celeste loved them with a ferocity that sometimes frightened her. They were the only good things in her life, the only things truly hers. She would have died for them without hesitation. She would have killed for them if she had to. But she never imagined she would have to watch them be taken from her, sold like animals to strangers, while their own father counted the money. The trouble began in the summer of 1855. Thomas Whitmore had racked up a gambling debt he could not pay. He owed 100,000 to a cotton broker from Natchez named Crawford, a man not known for patience. Crawford had given Whitmore multiple extensions, but his patience had run out. He wanted his money, and made it clear that if he did not get it, he would start talking publicly about Whitmore's debts. In the social world of Adams County, where reputation was everything, this threat was almost as frightening as physical violence. Whitmore was desperate. He had already borrowed all he could. He had sold off parcels of land until nothing was left to sell without losing the plantation itself. That year's crops had been mediocre, not enough to cover operating expenses, let alone pay his debts. He needed 100,000, and he needed it quickly. The solution, when it came to him, was brutally simple. He would sell some of his slaves. Slave sales were as common and unremarkable as selling livestock in the antebellum South. Every southern city had slave markets. Natchez had one of the largest in the region at Forks of the Road, where hundreds of enslaved people were sold monthly. Prices varied by age, health, and skills. A healthy adult male field hand could fetch 800 to 1,500. Women typically sold for less, unless they were skilled domestics or young and attractive, in which case they commanded premium prices for obvious and horrifying reasons. Children were generally worth less, but a healthy child who could grow into a productive worker was still valuable property. Thomas Whitmore knew exactly which slaves he would sell. Samuel was strong and healthy, already capable of real field work. He would fetch a good price. Eliza was young but pretty, domestically trained, the kind of girl who would appeal to certain buyers. Isaiah was young, but young children often sold in lots or to buyers looking for long-term investments. Together, the three might bring more than enough to cover the debt to Crawford. The fact that these children were his own flesh and blood apparently gave him no pause. Perhaps he never really thought of them as his children. Perhaps he had spent so many years denying their existence, he had convinced himself they meant nothing. Perhaps he was simply so desperate, so terrified of social ruin, he was willing to do anything to save himself. Whatever his reasoning, Thomas Whitmore made his decision. On a cool October morning in 1855, he set it in motion. Celeste knew nothing of what was coming. She woke before dawn, as always, and began her kitchen work. Assigned to domestic duties years earlier, she spent her days cooking, cleaning, and serving in the main house, while her children worked elsewhere. It was hard work, but it kept her close to the house, where she could sometimes catch glimpses of her children and know they were all right. The first sign something was wrong came mid-morning. Celeste heard horses approaching, more than usual. She looked out and saw three strangers riding up the drive with Thomas Whitmore. Well dressed, clearly men of means. They had the look of people who had come to do business. Something cold settled in Celeste's stomach. She had seen slave traders before, seen how they assessed human beings, reduced people to numbers and dollar signs. These men had that look. She tried to tell herself she was wrong, that Whitmore was selling field hands or older workers. But the cold feeling would not leave. When she saw one of the men pointing toward where the children usually played, her heart stopped. Celeste moved without thinking. She ran from the kitchen toward the slave quarters, ignoring shouts behind her. Driven only by the desperate need to reach her children, she found Samuel first, grabbed his arm, demanding to know where Eliza and Isaiah were. Before he could answer, she heard Eliza scream. The next few minutes were a nightmare Celeste would relive every night for years. White strangers grabbed her children, dragging them toward waiting horses. Samuel fought back. A man hit him across the face, so hard blood sprayed from his nose. Eliza cried and called for her mother, struggling against hands that gripped her thin arms like iron bands. Isaiah, just 5, stood frozen in terror, tears streaming, too frightened to make a sound. Celeste threw herself at the men. She clawed, scratched, and bit, fighting with every ounce of strength. It made no difference. Someone hit her from behind. She went down hard, face striking the dirt. By the time she pushed herself up, her children were being loaded into a wagon. Samuel, still fighting, had his hands tied. Eliza had gone limp, eyes empty with shock. Isaiah cried for his mama, reaching his small arms toward her, calling her name over and over. And standing beside the wagon, watching with a blank expression, was Thomas Whitmore. Celeste looked at him. This man who had violated her for nearly 2 decades, who had fathered her children, and was now selling them like livestock. And she felt something change inside. The fear and desperation transformed into something else, something cold, patient, deadly. She did not scream. She did not beg. She simply looked at Thomas Whitmore, and in that moment she made a silent vow. She did not know how, and she did not know when, but she would destroy him. She would take everything he had. She would make him suffer in ways he could not imagine. And then, when he had lost everything, she would find her children and bring them home. The wagon pulled away, carrying her children down the dusty road toward Natchez, where they would be separated and sold to different buyers. Samuel was sold to a cotton planter from Alabama named Jeremiah Stone. Eliza was purchased by a wealthy New Orleans family for domestic service. Isaiah, too young for immediate use, was sold cheaply to a Louisiana sugar plantation, where young children were often worked in the fields almost as soon as they could walk. Within a single morning, Thomas Whitmore had scattered his own children across 3 states. He paid Crawford and returned to his life as if nothing happened. He ate dinner in his fine dining room, served by enslaved people moving silently around him. He slept in his comfortable bed next to Margaret, who asked no questions. He woke the next morning and went about his business, never giving a second thought to the children he had sold or the woman whose life he had just destroyed. But Celeste was already planning. In the days following the sale, Celeste moved through her duties like a ghost. She cooked, cleaned, and served as always. She responded when spoken to, obeyed every command. To anyone watching, she appeared a woman who had accepted her loss, resigned to her reality. This was exactly what she wanted them to see. Inside, her mind worked constantly, turning over plans and possibilities, searching for weaknesses to exploit. She had no power, no money, no legal rights. She was property under constant surveillance. Any plan required perfect patience and absolute secrecy. One mistake, one suspicious move, and she would be sold away or beaten until she could no longer think clearly. The first thing Celeste needed was information. She needed to understand Thomas Whitmore's weaknesses, his secrets, the things he kept hidden. She needed leverage that would allow a powerless enslaved woman to bring down a white plantation owner in a society designed to make that impossible. Working in the main house gave her opportunities field slaves did not have. She was in and out of rooms all day, cleaning, cooking, serving. She overheard conversations not meant for her ears. She saw documents left on desks, letters in the mail, visitors coming and going. Most enslaved house workers learned to be selectively deaf and blind to protect themselves. Celeste did the opposite. She began paying attention to everything. At first, she did not know what she was looking for. She gathered information almost randomly, memorizing names, numbers, and conversation snippets without knowing their meaning. Thomas Whitmore talked of money troubles with visitors. Margaret wrote to her sister complaining of her husband's gambling. The overseer reported crop yields and slave productivity. Business associates discussed cotton prices and shipping. Celeste absorbed it all, filing everything away, waiting for something useful to emerge. The problem was Celeste could not read. Like most enslaved people in the South, she had never been taught. In most Southern states, it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write. Slaveholders understood literacy was power, that a person who could read could access information, forge passes, communicate secretly. They kept their human property illiterate deliberately as control. But Celeste knew if she was to find what she needed, she must learn, and she knew exactly who could teach her. His name was Solomon. Nearly 70, he had worked at Whitmore Hall since before Thomas was born. In his youth, he had been a house slave on a Virginia plantation where the master unusually allowed some slaves to learn basic reading and arithmetic. Solomon had learned as a child and kept that knowledge hidden for over 50 years. He was careful, never reading openly, never revealing his skill to anyone he did not trust completely. But Celeste had known him her whole time at Whitmore Hall, and she knew his secret. Once, late at night, she had seen him reading a scrap of newspaper. He looked up, saw her watching. For a long moment, they stared. Then she turned and walked away without a word. Neither ever spoke of it. Now she went to Solomon and asked him to teach her. It was an enormous risk for both. If caught, the consequences would be severe. Solomon could be sold, beaten, possibly killed. Celeste faced the same punishments. But Solomon looked at her, saw something in her eyes, and agreed. Maybe he recognized the rage and determination burning behind her calm exterior. Maybe he simply understood some risks were worth taking. They began meeting in secret late at night in a corner of the barn, unlikely to be discovered. Solomon taught Celeste the alphabet, then simple words, gradually more complex texts. Celeste was a fast learner, driven by a motivation that made her absorb information like dry soil absorbs rain. Within months, she could read basic documents. Within a year, she could read almost anything, though slowly and with effort. Now she could access previously closed information. She could read Margaret's letters left lying around. She could read business documents in Thomas Whitmore's study. She could read receipts and records tracking every financial transaction on the plantation. Gradually, a picture formed. Thomas Whitmore was not just struggling financially, he was on the verge of complete collapse. He owed money to almost everyone. Banks, merchants, fellow planters. He had borrowed against the plantation itself, meaning if he defaulted, he could lose everything. His cotton yields had declined for years, partly from refusal to invest in proper land management, partly from working his enslaved laborers so hard their productivity dropped from exhaustion and illness. Margaret had a small separate inheritance, but even that could not save him. Thomas Whitmore was a drowning man, pulling everyone around him under. This was useful, but not enough. Financial troubles might embarrass Whitmore, but would not destroy him. Planters went into debt all the time. Many great Southern fortunes were built on borrowed money. Whitmore's creditors might pressure him, force asset sales, but they would not bring the ruin Celeste wanted. She needed something more, something that would turn his community against him, make him an outcast, something unforgivable. She found it in the spring of 1857, almost 2 years after her children were sold. Cleaning Thomas Whitmore's study, Celeste found a letter carelessly left in an unlocked drawer, addressed to a man named Harrison, one of Whitmore's oldest friends from school. It was several years old, dated around Isaiah's birth, written in Whitmore's own hand. What she read made her hands shake. The letter was casual, almost joking, the way men write to old friends when they think no one else will read their words. Whitmore complained about his cold, unaffectionate wife and boasted of his relationship with Celeste. But it was not a relationship ordinary people might imagine. Whitmore wrote of his children, Samuel, Eliza, and the newborn baby, making his paternity absolutely clear. He made crude jokes about his shadow family in the slave quarters. He expressed satisfaction his real legacy might be carried by children who would never bear his name. He even mentioned physical characteristics, proving the children were his. Details no one could know without close observation. It was a confession in his own hand, signed with his own name, and Celeste held it. She stood in the study, barely breathing, reading the letter over and over. Her heart pounded in her throat. She knew she had found what she sought. This letter, if it reached the right people, could destroy Thomas Whitmore more completely than any financial scandal. Here was what white Southern society refused to acknowledge openly, but could not ignore when confronted with proof. Masters fathered children with enslaved women constantly, but they did not admit it. They did not write about it. They certainly did not joke about it in letters that could fall into the wrong hands. The whole system depended on collective denial, a willingness to pretend light-skinned children in slave quarters appeared from nowhere. When a man was publicly exposed as the father of enslaved children, when evidence was undeniable, social consequences could be devastating. Other planters would distance themselves. Business partners would cut ties. The polite fiction holding the rotten system together would be exposed as a lie, and everyone who participated would resent the man who forced them to confront it. But the financial implications were more significant. Thomas Whitmore had not just fathered children with an enslaved woman. He had sold them. The buyers believed they were purchasing what the slave trade called full-blooded Negroes, not the mixed-race children of a white planter. In the twisted logic of the antebellum slave market, this was fraud. Buyers had paid for one type of merchandise and received another. They could demand refunds. They could sue. They could accuse Whitmore of deliberately misrepresenting his goods. This was not about morality. Morality had nothing to do with how the South operated. This was about money and reputation, the only things that truly mattered to men like Thomas Whitmore. And Celeste had found the weapon to take both away. But she could not act yet. She needed to plan carefully, gather more evidence, figure out how to expose Whitmore without getting herself killed. So she carefully placed the letter back exactly as found and returned to work. She gave no sign anything had changed. She cooked dinner that night, as always, cleaned the dishes, went to her cabin, lay in darkness, and began to plan. Over the next several months, Celeste gathered more evidence. She found Margaret Whitmore's diary, containing pages of anguished entries about her suspicions regarding her husband and that woman. Margaret never confronted Thomas directly, never spoke openly, but wrote everything in her private journal. She described children in slave quarters who looked so much like her husband. She wrote of finding Thomas leaving Celeste's cabin late at night. She documented her humiliation and rage, all in her handwriting. Creating a record corroborating the letter to Harrison, Celeste also saved small physical evidence. Locks of hair from Samuel and Eliza kept since they were babies, a small toy Thomas carved for Samuel when the boy was very young, before Whitmore hardened himself to his children's existence. Alone, these proved nothing, but combined with written evidence, they created a picture difficult to deny. The final piece involved the buyers. Celeste needed to find who they were and where they had taken Samuel, Eliza, and Isaiah. This was not easy. Slave sales were often poorly documented. and sellers had no obligation to tell enslaved parents anything. But Celeste listened carefully whenever business was discussed, eventually piecing together basic facts. Samuel bought by Alabama planter Jeremiah Stone, Eliza purchased by the Beaumont family in New Orleans. Isaiah sold to a Louisiana sugar operation, though she could not discover the exact location. Now she had evidence and knew who had her children. The question was how to use it. Celeste could not simply mail the letter and diary pages herself. She could not read and write in a way allowing direct communication with white people. Even if she could, no one would believe accusations from an enslaved woman. They would assume she lied or simply not care. She needed someone else to deliver the information, someone whose word would be taken seriously. She found that person in the fall of 1857. James Crawford, the same cotton broker to whom Thomas Whitmore owed $1,000 2 years earlier. Crawford was not a moral man. He bought and sold cotton produced by slave labor with no qualms about the institution. But he was a businessman with contempt for people who cheated, lied, and failed to pay debts. He still resented Whitmore for stringing him along for months, and always looked for information giving him advantage over competitors and debtors. Celeste took an enormous risk. She approached Crawford when he visited the plantation, waiting until he was alone, and told him she had information about Thomas Whitmore worth a great deal. Crawford was suspicious, but Celeste was careful. She did not reveal everything at once. She gave just enough to pique interest, hinting at scandal and fraud without details. She said Whitmore sold children under false pretenses, and buyers would be interested to learn the truth. Crawford was intrigued. He did not trust Celeste, but recognized she might be telling the truth. He agreed to investigate, saying if her information proved accurate, he would ensure it reached those who needed to know. Over the next weeks, Crawford did his own research. He contacted buyers, asking casual questions about their purchases and satisfaction. He examined sales records, noting descriptions of children. When he confirmed enough to believe Celeste's story, he returned and asked for evidence. Celeste gave him copies of the letter and diary pages, painstakingly reproduced by hand during late nights in the barn, practicing writing skills Solomon taught her. She gave locks of hair and the carved toy, and told everything about Thomas Whitmore's relationship with her and the children he fathered and sold. Crawford took the information and disappeared. For weeks, Celeste heard nothing. She continued work, giving no sign anything was different, waiting, hoping her plan would work. She did not know if Crawford would follow through, if evidence would be enough, if she would survive to see results. Then, in early 1858, everything began to fall apart for Thomas Whitmore. The first sign was a letter arriving at Whitmore Hall on a cold January morning, marked urgent. Celeste served breakfast as Whitmore opened it. She watched his face while pretending to arrange dishes. She saw color drain from his cheeks, his hands tremble. He read it twice, then a third time, as if unable to believe what was written. The letter was from Jeremiah Stone, the Alabama planter who bought Samuel nearly 3 years earlier. Stone did not waste words. He wrote he recently received disturbing information about the boy he purchased. That Samuel was not, as represented, the child of 2 enslaved parents, but the illegitimate son of Whitmore himself. Stone demanded an explanation and a full refund of the $400 paid, plus compensation for expenses housing and feeding. Damaged goods. Thomas Whitmore put down the letter and stared at nothing. Margaret asked what was wrong. He said it was nothing, just business. But Celeste saw fear in his eyes. Saw him beginning to understand something terrible was happening, something he could not control. Over the next weeks, more letters arrived. The Beaumont family in New Orleans, who purchased Eliza, wrote similar accusations and demands. They were angrier. They bought Eliza to serve in their household, attend their daughters, help with domestic work. Now they learned she was the half-sister of their children's playmates, the daughter of a white man who sold his own flesh and blood. The social implications horrified them. What if someone found out? What if friends learned they had an enslaved girl sharing blood with the white planter class? They wanted money back immediately, and Whitmore to take the girl back before scandal spread. The sugar plantation that bought Isaiah did not bother with letters. They sent a representative directly to Adams County, a hard-faced man who arrived at Whitmore Hall, demanding to speak privately. Celeste did not hear what was said, but saw Whitmore afterward. He looked like a man told he was dying. News spread through Adams County like wildfire. James Crawford, true to his nature, did not keep information to himself. He shared it with business associates who shared with friends, who shared with wives, who spread it through every parlor and drawing room in Natchez. Within weeks, everyone knew. Thomas Whitmore fathered children with an enslaved woman. Thomas Whitmore sold those children to unsuspecting buyers. Thomas Whitmore committed fraud, lied, violated unwritten codes governing how such things were handled. The reaction was swift and merciless. This was not about morality. No one in Adams County cared Whitmore raped an enslaved woman for 18 years. That was common, unremarkable. No one cared particularly he fathered children. That too was common, though supposed to remain unacknowledged. They cared about fraud. They cared about public exposure. They cared that Whitmore was caught, his dirty secrets dragged into light, his carelessness threatening to expose the whole rotten system they all participated in. Other planters distanced themselves immediately. Men who dined at his table, hunted on his land, suddenly found reasons to be unavailable. Invitations to social events stopped. At church, people moved away as if he carried disease. Margaret sat rigid and pale in their pew, enduring stares and whispers, face a mask of humiliation. Financial consequences followed. Creditors, patient for years, demanded immediate payment. Banks called in loans. Business partners willing to overlook gambling and mismanagement now wanted nothing to do with him. Within 3 months, Thomas Whitmore went from struggling but respectable planter to pariah who could not borrow money. Buyers made good on threats. Jeremiah Stone filed a lawsuit in Alabama demanding refund plus damages for fraud and misrepresentation. The Beaumont family did the same in Louisiana. The sugar plantation joined legal action. Suddenly, Thomas Whitmore faced litigation in 3 different states with potential judgments, far exceeding anything he could pay. But the worst blow came from inside his own house. Margaret Whitmore spent years pretending not to know about her husband and Celeste. She buried suspicions, swallowed humiliation, maintained the facade of a respectable marriage, expected of women of her class and time. Now her private shame was public knowledge. Everyone knew, friends, family. Her children at school in Virginia would eventually hear gossip. Everything she worked to hide was exposed, forcing her to confront truth she spent years denying. Margaret did not handle it well. Spring 1858, she showed signs of what people then called nervous collapse. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She sat for hours staring, or flew into sudden rages, screaming at servants, throwing things. She became obsessed. Everyone was laughing at her. She was a joke. Her entire life a lie. Her sister came from Virginia to care for her, but Margaret only grew worse. By summer, she stopped speaking coherently, muttering about children and blood and lies, sometimes laughing for no reason. In August 1858, Margaret Whitmore's family had her committed to the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum in Jackson. She spent the rest of her life there, never recovering sanity, never returning home. The woman who spent years maintaining appearances was finally destroyed by truth she refused to face. Thomas Whitmore was now alone, his wife gone, his legitimate sons informed of scandal, refused communication. Friends abandoned him. Creditors circled like vultures. Lawsuits from Alabama, Louisiana, and Sugar Country ground forward, promising to take whatever he had left. Celeste watched from shadows. She continued work in the house, cooking, cleaning, serving, giving no sign she had connection to catastrophe engulfing her master. If anyone suspected she was responsible, they did not say. The idea an enslaved woman could orchestrate such complex destruction would seem absurd to most white people of the time. They could not imagine someone considered property capable of such intelligence, patience, ruthless determination. But Celeste was not finished. Fall 1858, Whitmore Hall was put up for sale to satisfy debts. Plantation house, equipment, all enslaved people to be auctioned. This was the moment Celeste waited for, but also greatest danger. If sold to a new owner, she might end up anywhere. Far from Mississippi, far from hope of finding her children, separated from everything worked for over 3 years. She had one more card to play. James Crawford, who helped spread information, had become something unexpected. If not an ally, at least a useful contact. Crawford profited handsomely from Whitmore's downfall, buying debts at discount, positioning himself to acquire choice pieces of the estate. He was not good, but practical. And Celeste proved a valuable source of information. She approached Crawford weeks before auction. She told him she wanted freedom. She said she had more information. Secrets overheard about other planters during years in the Whitmore house. She could be useful, continue gathering information, providing advantages. All she wanted in return was freedom. Crawford considered. A businessman, he recognized a good deal. An enslaved woman who could read, proven capable of gathering and using sensitive information, with connections throughout domestic slave networks of Adams County. Such a person worth far more free than enslaved. If he bought and freed her, she would owe him. She would work willingly from gratitude and self-interest, not compulsion. He would have a spy in places he could never go, he agreed. At the auction of the Whitmore estate in October 1858, James Crawford purchased Celeste for $350. 1 week later, he signed papers legally manumitting her, making her a free woman for the first time in her life. She was approximately 36, spent over 2 decades enslaved. Now, finally, she could begin work planned since the day her children were taken. Finding her children would not be easy. The South in 1858 was vast, hostile territory for a free black woman traveling alone. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant any black person could be seized, claimed as a runaway with almost no legal protection. Free papers could be stolen, destroyed, ignored. Traveling between states required navigating a maze of local laws and customs, risking imprisonment or worse. Buyers had no obligation to sell, no matter how much money Celeste offered. But Celeste had advantages most in her position did not. She could read and write. She had connections to Crawford, and through him to merchants and traders throughout the South. She spent 3 years gathering information about the slave trade, learning how it worked, understanding routes, markets, paperwork moving human beings. She had unshakable determination. She also had money, not much but some. Crawford gave a small sum as part of their arrangement, enough to travel and support herself months. She supplemented by working as a domestic servant in Natchez, saving every penny, building a fund to buy her children's freedom. Her first target was Samuel. Samuel sold to Jeremiah Stone, cotton planter in Marengo County, Alabama. Celeste knew from Crawford's contacts Stone was a plaintiff in the lawsuit against Whitmore, meaning he was angry, might negotiate. She traveled to Alabama, spring 1859, carrying free papers and letters of introduction from Crawford, presented herself at Stone's plantation. The meeting did not go well initially. Stone, suspicious of a free black woman traveling alone, asking about one of his slaves, threatened to have her arrested as a troublemaker. But Celeste, calm, persistent. She explained Samuel was her son. She had money, offered to buy at fair price, higher than Stone originally paid. Appealed to self-interest, pointing out he was entangled in expensive litigation with Whitmore, selling Samuel one less complication. Stone thought it over. He never comfortable with Samuel since learning truth of boy's parentage. Presence of a white man's son among his slaves, awkward reminder of things he preferred not to think about. Celeste offered cash, more than boy worth on open market. He agreed to sell. Price is $500, more than Celeste had. She returned to Mississippi, spent 6 months working, saving, borrowing small amounts from Crawford and free black communities in Natchez supporting her cause. Fall 1859, she had money. Returned to Alabama, paid Jeremiah Stone, walked out with her son. Samuel was 15. He barely recognized his mother. He spent 4 years as a field hand working dawn to dusk, beaten when slowing, half-starved during lean times. The boy who fought men taking him now, a young man with scars on his back, wariness in eyes breaking Celeste's heart. But he was alive. He was free. He was with her. They traveled back to Mississippi. Celeste immediately began planning next rescue. Eliza in New Orleans, owned by Beaumont family. More complicated. New Orleans, large city with complex slave market. Beaumont's wealthy, might not want to sell. But Celeste learned from first success, patience and persistence could overcome impossible obstacles. She traveled to New Orleans early 1860, spent weeks gathering information about Beaumont household. Learned routines, finances, social connections. Learned Eliza became skilled seamstress. More valuable, but family preparing to move to France to escape growing tensions over slavery dividing the country. They would not want to take slaves. They would be looking to sell. Celeste positioned herself as buyer, used Crawford's connections to present as representative of free black community in Ohio looking to purchase enslaved people, bring North to freedom. Plausible story, gave cover protecting from too many questions. Beaumont's agreed to sell Eliza for $600, more money than Celeste ever seen, but she prepared. She saved, borrowed, did everything necessary to have funds ready. March 1860, Celeste bought her daughter's freedom. Eliza was 13. Thin, quiet, eyes too old for her face. Spent nearly 5 years serving Beaumont household, learning to sew, clean, make herself useful, learning invisibility as mother learned decades before. When Celeste found her, told her who she was, Eliza did not cry, did not speak, stared at mother long moment, then nodded as if always knew this day would come. Now Celeste had 2 children. But Isaiah still missing. Finding Isaiah hardest task. Sold to Louisiana sugar plantation, but Celeste never determined exactly which. Sugar country, different world from cotton plantations. More brutal, deadly. He enslaved on sugar plantations, shorter life expectancies than almost anywhere south. Worked to death in grinding mills, boiling houses processing raw cane. Child sold into that world at 5 might not survive to 10. Celeste spent over 2 years searching for youngest son. Traveled throughout Louisiana following rumors, leads often false. Bribed overseers, clerks for plantation records. Questioned enslaved people who might have seen boy matching description. Faced constant danger from suspicious whites disliking free blacks asking questions, slave catchers seeing opportunity to kidnap, sell back into bondage, hazards of travel in region on brink of civil war. War itself complicated everything. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter April 1861. South erupted into chaos. Travel dangerous, unpredictable. Networks Celeste relied on disrupted. Many who helped now focused on survival, not concerns of one woman searching for child. But Celeste did not give up, could not come this far. Destroyed powerful white man, freed herself, rescued 2 children, only to abandon third. Isaiah out there somewhere. She would find him or die trying. She found him spring 1863. Isaiah on plantation called Belter, about 50 miles west of New Orleans. He was 12. Survived 8 years in sugar fields, remarkable itself. But survival came at cost. Isaiah, small for age, malnourished, scarred. Walked with limp from old injury never healed properly. When Celeste found him, told him who she was, he did not know her. He was 5 when taken. No memory of mother's face, voice songs she sang at night. For Isaiah, Celeste stranger, woman appearing from nowhere claiming family. Suspicious, frightened, angry all at once. But Celeste patient. Spent years patient. Could wait longer. Purchase of Isaiah's freedom different because of war. Belter Union, occupied territory, spring 1863. Emancipation Proclamation theoretically freed all enslaved in Confederate states. But reality complicated. Many still held by masters, refusing to acknowledge proclamation. Many fled to Union lines, living in contraband camps, free in name, struggling to survive. Legal status of people like Isaiah unclear. Plantation owners did everything to maintain control. Celeste did not try to buy Isaiah. Instead, went to Union officers administering region, told her story. Showed free papers for Samuel and Eliza. Told of Thomas Whitmore, what he did, sale of his children, systematic fraud, cruelty defining his life, asked help retrieve son. Officers moved by story, perhaps recognized propaganda value of narrative, illustrating horrors of slavery perfectly. Perhaps simply decent men wanting right thing. Whatever reasons, sent soldiers to Belter, brought Isaiah out. Celeste held youngest son first time in 8 years. He stiff in arms, uncertain, still unable to believe real. But she held him, whispered everything all right now. Told him looking for him so long. Told him never let him go again. Months for Isaiah to trust her. Years to begin healing from what done. But Celeste patient, always patient. Slowly, carefully, rebuilt family Thomas Whitmore tried to destroy. As for Whitmore, story ended exactly as Celeste planned. After sale of plantation and all property, Thomas Whitmore left with nothing. Lawsuits consumed remaining assets. Creditors took everything. He moved to Natchez boarding house, lived in single room, drank himself into oblivion day after day. Man who dreamed of being great planter of Mississippi, now penniless drunk, who could not walk down street without people pointing, whispering. War finished what Celeste started. Union forces occupied Natchez 1863. Whitmore lost small income from Confederate bond investments. Arrested briefly as Confederate sympathizer, though never supported Southern cause with more than words. After release, returned to boarding house, continued drinking. Thomas Whitmore died 1864, alone in rented room from liver failure brought on by years of alcoholism. He was 52. No one came to funeral except minister paid to say few words over grave. Legitimate sons surviving war did not attend. Wife Margaret still alive in Jackson Asylum, unaware husband died. Newspapers did not mention passing. Man who sold his own children for $100,000 died forgotten, unmourned, exactly as deserved. Celeste outlived him nearly 30 years. After war, settled in Ohio with 3 children. Samuel became carpenter, building houses for growing black community in Cincinnati. Eliza became seamstress as trained, eventually opened dress shop, serving black and white customers. Isaiah, despite difficult start, learned read and write, became teacher, dedicating life to educating black children denied knowledge, setting them free. Celeste never remarried, never fully trusted any man after Thomas Whitmore. But not alone. Surrounded by children, eventually grandchildren calling her Mama Celeste, listening to stories of old days, what slavery like, What she did to survive, save people loved. Told of patience. Told power of knowledge. How learning read gave weapons no one could take. Told importance of remembering. Never forgetting what done to their people so never happen again. Did not often speak of revenge. But sometimes late at night, grandchildren asleep, just her and adult children sitting together, she smile small private smile, say many kinds of justice in world. Some justice from courts, laws, some from God. Some from people refusing accept powerless, who watched, waited, planned until moment right, then brought down enemies with nothing but truth, patience, unbreakable will. Celeste died 1891, approximately 69. Buried Cincinnati Cemetery, surrounded children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Gravestone, paid by descendants, bore simple inscription she chose. She found her children. By death, Celeste had over 20 living descendants. Everyone free. Everyone knew story of ancestor enslaved, violated, watched children sold away. Everyone knew how she responded. Not violence, not despair, but intelligence, patience. Love so powerful no world cruelty could defeat. Thomas Whitmore believed could do anything to Celeste, because she property. Because law said no rights, because entire structure Southern society built to protect men like him, crush women like her. He wrong. System seeming powerful, permanent, impossible challenge built on lies, cruelty, systematic denial, human dignity. Systems built such foundations always more fragile than appear. Celeste understood something Whitmore never did: power, not always visible. Not always from wealth, weapons, legal authority. Sometimes power from knowing what enemy wants hide. Sometimes from patience. Willingness wait years for right moment. Sometimes from love. Desperate determination of mother moving heaven, earth to save children. Enslaved woman Thomas Whitmore, thought owned turned architect, his destruction. Children sold like livestock grew free citizens of nation, abolishing institution, once held chains. Family tried scatter across 3 states, came back together, built legacy outlasting his name generations. Some debts not paid in money, some debts paid in ruin, some chains determination, love, righteous anger, strong.